Hebrew. Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma Daf Kuf Vav. Reminding everyone there will be a Siyum Be'ezrat Hashem on Sunday, March 3rd. We are nearing the end of this long and complicated Masechet, so always a good reason to celebrate. And we'll have a good lineup of Shiurim. Everything will go up Be'ezrat Hashem on Sunday. Today's stuff is sponsored by Judy Schwartz in loving memory of her parents, Yechezkel Shraga ben Yehuda Lev Halevi and Esther Tidor, whose Yortzeit is 7th of Adar, and Shirley K. Tidor, Sarah Rezel Bat Mordechai Yitzchak, and Frida Sima, whose Yortzeit was on the 23rd of Shvat. They would have been thrilled to know their daughter and granddaughters learned Daf Yomi. Today's stuff is sponsored by Tzvorit Goodman in loving memory of Harav Ara Moshe Goodman. Today's stuff is sponsored by the Hadran women of Long Island in honor of Gita's granddaughter, Esther Rosenberg's engagement to Baruch Lapidus. May the couple be blessed with a lifetime of good health, happiness, and nachat. And today's stuff is sponsored by the Tannenbaum family in loving memory of Miriam's father, Yaakov Yitzchak ben Moshe Nachum Halevi, Zichrono Lebracha, Jack Zemsky, on his 20th Yortzeit tomorrow. His life embodied a metaphoric reading of the Pasuk V'nikrav Balabayit El Elohim. We will talk about today. He was one whose actions were infused with drawing closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. His modeling of Ahavat Yisrael, Ahavat Hashem, continue to inspire us. Yehi Zichro Ahuf. Okay, we're going to get started. We ended yesterday's daf with Rav Sheshet. Okay, Rav Sheshet had this very interesting, we're going to have a few interesting opinions today, kind of atypical opinions. Rav Sheshet basically says this whole thing where it says in the Torah, you take an oath, and then if you lied, you said, I gave you something to watch, you claimed it was yours, you lied about it under oath, when it turns out you were lying, again, depending on either if you admitted, or if you took it, or if Adim came, right? If Adim come, you have to pay kefil. And basically, what he says is, we would have thought that when do you become thought of as a thief? Because this item was in your house the whole time. So there has to be some point where you turn from being a shomer to a thief. When does that happen? We thought when you take the oath. Comes Rav Sheshet, and he says, no. As soon as you deny my claim, you become a thief. Now, why is it relevant? Well, according to Rav Sheshet, that's when you're chayav ba'onsin. That's when you become liable for replacing it no matter what happens to it. When you're a shomer, you're not, depending on which shomer, you're not liable for all kinds of damages. You're liable for a whole bunch, negligence, depending on what kind of shomer you are. But once you steal, you're liable to return it no matter what it is. That's the whole thing about a gazlan is koneh, right? You acquire the item, which means you basically have to pay it at the value you stole it no matter what happens to it. So that was Rav Sheshet. We brought a potential proof, a Tanatuna, right? Which sounds funny, Tanatuna, but what it means is, right, we're going to find a source for this in a Tanaitic source, but he's not really successful. We rejected his reading because it's not necessarily the way to read it. Now we're going to have two questions from Tanaitic sources against Rav Sheshet, starting 5 lines from the bottom. Mativ Rami bar Chama, the bottom of Kufay Amabet. Yeah, this is an interesting concept. This is something we're going to actually prove from a pasuk later on today, possible reading of a pasuk, that in a general case where there's an oath, like we talked about yesterday, if one witness says that you have something of mine in your possession and I want to try to get it from you, right? I can't get it unless I have 2 witnesses. But if one witness comes, the witness can make you take an oath. If you don't take that oath, you're going to have to pay me. Now, what type of oath is this? It's called the nishba ve'eno meshalem. That is our typical oath that we have, which means you take an oath to exempt you from payment. That fits in with the whole principle of hamotzi mechaveiro alav haraya, right? It's much harder for me to get money out of you. So that means I generally, if we have an argument and an eid echad means, he can say, okay, now you have to take an oath. Who takes the oath? Not the person who's trying to get the money. I can't take an oath to collect. You can take an oath to exempt you from payment. That's nishba ve'eno meshalem, an exemption oath. That's the typical type oath. However, there's situations where you are not a trustworthy person, because maybe you had an incident once before where you lied, you took an oath falsely, and you weren't believed. So because of that, in that scenario, let's say one witness comes and says that item in your house really belongs to Michelle, and because of that witness, you now have to take an oath, but you're not trustworthy because we'll give you 3 cases right now. What would be that? It's called shekenegdo chashud al hashvuah. The one opposite me is not trusted when it comes to oaths. Like, for example, echad shvuat ha'idut, echad shvuat pikadon, echad shvuat shav, 3 potential shvuas. One of them is our shvuah, but pikadon, that you at some point denied a claim, you were watching someone's item and you lied under oath and said it was yours and it wasn't true. If that happens, and that happened, let's say 3 years ago. So now when I claim that there's something in your house that's mine, not necessarily pikadon, just I see something of mine, I'm like, you must have stolen that. You're supposed to take an oath to basically, right? And if I have one witness to support me, you're supposed to take an oath. But since you're not trustworthy, I take the oath instead, and I can take an oath and collect from you. That's an atypical oath, but it's going to be that way because you're suspect. Now, what does this have to do with our topic? Well, in Ita, if we say that as soon as you claim, okay, let's say it was a different case where, let's say let's go back to Ruth and Naomi. You're Ruth. I claim you have something of mine, and you're supposed to take this oath because I brought a witness. But 3 years ago, Ruth had an issue with Naomi, and Naomi said, here, I gave you this item to watch, and now you didn't give it back to me. And Ruth says, oh, it was stolen from me, and she doesn't lie under oath, but she just claims that it was actually in her house. Well, that should also make Ruth not trustworthy, because if Rav Sheshet says just by her denying the claim, that's basically enough, well, then why wouldn't that be the case here? So in Ita, bikfiru de ifsaleh, just by Ruth denying a case, not necessarily under oath, according to Rav Sheshet, even in denial. Amre, there's two different kinds of cases where Ruth could deny a claim. If Naomi comes to collect her animal and that she gave to Ruth, and Ruth says, I don't have it. It was stolen from me. And really, it wasn't in Ruth's house at the time. Okay, if it was in Ruth's house at the time, that's basically what Rav Sheshet's saying. That already just denying the claim without taking an oath is severe. But this case, where it didn't mention denying the claim, it's because denying the claim when it's out in the grazing or hanging out by the marsh and not anywhere in the house. If Ruth says, "Oh, I don't have it," she could be just pushing Naomi off. It doesn't necessarily. She didn't mean, "I don't have it. I'm never going to return it." Now it sounded that way, but since it wasn't in her house at the time, she was just saying, I'll push Naomi off for right now until I get it back. And that, a kfira wouldn't be enough. Even Rav Sheshet would agree with that. Okay, just denying it doesn't really mean that she was lying. It's like we call a white lie. Okay, that's not as significant. And we're going to further prove that there's such a distinction. Someone who denies alone. Actually, if I come and say, Ruth, you owe me money, and Ruth says, what are you talking about? Also, we're not going to make her pasula edut just for saying that. Again, if she took an oath, it would be a different story. But just by saying that, she's still kasher edut, because we assume she's just pushing me off because she doesn't have the money. And if you don't have it in hand to return, you might just say, oh yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. And a few days later, you'll come and say, oh yeah, you said there was a loan here, you're right. Obviously, if you take an oath, that's a different story. But just a claim is not enough. But pikadon pasula edu. But when it comes to a pikadon, and here we'd have to translate pikadon in a case where it's in your house, right? If Ruth had it in her house and denied the claim, that is where Rav Sheshet is talking about. Denial of a claim when it's in your house, that's going to be a no-no. That's going to mean you're not trusted. But when this source talked about, now this is a little bit weird because it's an inference on a source, it's an ukimta on an inference. We're saying the inference from that source that only is shvua meant not if it's just a denial, but what kind of denial wouldn't be that Ruth wouldn't be trustworthy? It would be a denial if the animal wasn't in her house anymore, or the object wasn't in her house at the time. Okay, second attempt to knock out Rav Sheshet, but also going to be unsuccessful. Ba'amar Ilfa shvua koneh. Now, what does it mean shvua koneh? Shvua koneh means, what we think it means, and in the end, to explain this, we're going to actually say this is time about something totally different. And from there, we're going to get off on a tangent of something that's going to take us through most of the daf and is actually going to be quite complicated. But let's just explain the first reading of Ilfa. Ilfa says a shvua is koneh. What does that mean? It's koneh. Well, that means it acquires it for you. That means what we think it means is if Ruth claims the stolen item, the item you gave me to watch, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have it. I never had it, or it's not here anymore. It was stolen from me and all that. And she takes an oath about it. Then it becomes acquired by her. What does that mean? Like Rav Sheshet said, well, not like Rav Sheshet, but the issue that Rav Sheshet brought up, that she's going to be chayiv and onsim. Now, what does it seem to imply here? What makes her chayiv and onsim? What makes her the owner of this item now that she now has to return it no matter what at the value it is? Shvua hi dekanya, aval kfira lo kanya. It sounds like the shvua is what's kone. The shvua is what is where we draw the line. If it happened just that she denied the claim, that wouldn't be sufficient. Hachanami. So one answer is to say hachanami dekayma ba'agam. Maybe again you could say the shvua is the only thing that's kone if the animal wasn't in Ruth's house, because then just a denial, exactly as we said in the previous, just a denial doesn't really mean too much. But if it were in her house, then denial would also be kone. But the second alternative is to say shvua kona means something entirely different. And this is where we're going to get off on a big tangent. My shvua kona kede Rav Huna, as Rav Huna said, and it's really Rav. The Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav, because Rav Huna quoted Rav as saying this, and from now on we're going to talk in the sugya as if it's Rav saying it, because it is. I mean, it was Rav Huna quoting Rav. Shvua kona means something else. Mana li biyadcha. I go to Ruth and say, you have something of mine. V'hala omer en lecha biyadi. And Ruth says, I know what you're talking about. You know, it could be a loan, it could be any kind of thing. We'll have to see what Rav says it's about later. We're going to actually narrow it down. But I claim you have something of mine. And Ruth says, I don't know what you're talking about. Vinishba. And Ruth takes an oath. Now, achar kach ba'u edim. After that, witnesses come and show that Ruth actually still has it and has to return it to me. Patur. Actually, Ruth is exempt. This is a crazy halakha. Okay, this means that if Ruth denies my claim under oath and then is proven to be a liar, she doesn't actually, now it's a little tricky, but maybe not return it to me at all. Doesn't have to pay, you know, normally we'd say if it was to'in tanakanav, it would be kefel. If it was to'in tanaravad, it would be the chomesh, the asham. Everything this basically undermines a lot of things that we learned until now. If witnesses come, she's exempt. Why? It's a fascinating thing. It says here, the pasuk says, okay, let's read the whole pasuk. Shvuat Hashem tiya ben shnehem. There will be an oath between the two of them. This is in the case of a shomer sachar. Im lo shalach yado melech re'ehu. Okay, we're going to darshan this all another time. V'lakach ba'alav v'lo yishalem. What is lakach ba'alav v'lo yishalem? What does he take? The owner takes something. What does he take? The guy said, Ruth said, she doesn't owe me anything. I take the shvua, meaning I got something. Okay, what did I get? Well, I got satisfaction in that I think you have it. You claim you don't. You took an oath, Ruth. That already means that I got something. Okay, it's a little bit weird, right? I didn't really get anything. But I got satisfaction in that you gave me an oath, and that's enough for me to live with. And at this point, lo yishalem. Once I got the shvua, you will not have to pay mammon anymore. Now, how far we take the statement, and in what case do we take the statement? It's going to take us a little while to figure out. Right now, it sounds like it's across the board. You take an oath. Now, here it did say you take an oath and there's witnesses. Someone's going to suggest later that maybe even you take an oath and then you admit, which is difficult because both these cases, the Torah already said, if you take an oath, you know, if you swear it was stolen and then it turns out it wasn't, witnesses come, you have to pay kefel. And if you admit, you have to pay keren chomesh and asham. So we're going to have to narrow down to what case this is referring that's not already addressed by the Torah, that kind of the Torah says otherwise. But it's this very interesting that we really it needs a lot more thinking about to figure out why this is. But it's saying that you took an oath. That's already, the Baalim got something for it, okay? We got an oath. I got an oath. Now, that's it. I'm not going to get anything after that. Okay, that means, so again, shvua kona, that's what it means. It means shvua kona, you now, the chayfetz, it's like it's yours, okay? And then you can keep it and you don't have to ever pay me back. And that's the same thing as what Rav is saying, and that means it has nothing to do with Rav Sheshet. And with that, we're done with the question of Rav Sheshet. We had two questions against Rav Sheshet. The second one, we had two answers. One was the same as the first answer, and the second was a new one. Now we're going to go into this statement because it's very strange. Goof. Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav. Manali biyad chabala omer en lecha biyadi klum v'nishba'u ba'u edin patur shneimar v'lakach ba'alav v'lo yishalem kevan shekablu ba'alim shvua shuv em mishalmim mamon. That was just a quote of what we just said. So first, Rav is going to come and narrow it. Then we're going to have, I'll tell you the structure because it's going to be quite complicated, but if you get the structure in advance, maybe it'll help you. We're going to have Rava who's going to narrow it a little bit. Then we're going to have three questions. The second one, Rav Hamnuna's question, and you'll see in a minute why I'm getting to this. Then we're going to have Rava again come And because of the third question that Rav is going to raise, we're going to narrow down this line of Rav to even less cases than we narrowed it in the beginning. And then we're going to go back and say something, we're going to struggle with something Rav Hamnuna said and ask this question against him and then reinterpret what Rav Hamnuna's question was. Okay, we're going to basically bring three questions, answers to the first two, no answer to the third. From that, we're going to change a little bit. Then we're going to go back to question two and just reinterpret it a little better. Okay, or change our understanding of it, and that's going to be the end of this section. Okay, it's a little bit of a complicated section, so prepare yourselves. Amar Rava, mistaber milte de Rav b'milva, de lo tza'anitzna, aval b'pikadon b'reshute demarikai. He says, when I first heard Rav, actually, he's not going to narrow Rav. I'm mistaken. He's going to try to narrow down Rav, and then he's actually going to say it's not true, though. It would make sense, and you can agree, I would assume, that when Rav said this statement, he meant if it was a loan, because what happens with a loan? I give you money, you use the money, and then you owe me money. So it's not like you have my money in your possession. When I claim you owe me $100. It's not like there's a $100 bill in your house that has my name on it. So I get it, he says, when Rav says that, and I assume Rav meant it only in that kind of case. But if Ruth has an item of mine in her house, or had an item of mine in her house that she was supposed to return, maybe it's lost now, or I don't know what, but she had it and used it and stole it and claimed, it'd be very hard for me to believe that Rav said it in that case. Okay, and that's what he said. I assumed because it was in your domain, the actual object, it's not like money that you're supposed to spend and then return me some other money. But this object you were supposed to return, I'm sure Rav didn't say that in that case. I would have thought. But Elohim Amarav, but I swear Rav said it, afilu b'pikadon. Now why? And it's obvious why, even though logically it doesn't make any sense. But again, because what did Rav say? I just want to make sure you have this clear. Rav said that in the event that Ruth lies about the object that is in her house that I gave her to watch, she lies about it, claims she doesn't have it, under oath, swears, then witnesses come and say, you have it, she doesn't have to return it to me. So we would think that Rav didn't say that in that kind of case. But it must be he did, because the chiktiv krabapik kadon. His whole pasuk was from the shomer sachar case. So you can't, right? V'lakach ba'alav v'lo yishalem is his proof pasuk. And that pasuk is in the context of a pikadon, of me giving you something to watch. So he obviously did say it in that case. So that's the first section. Now we're going to get to three questions. Yativ Rav Nachman Kamma lahashmata. So the first is introduced by the fact, and we'll kind of end the story by relating back to this, and this question before we get back to the second question. Rav Nachman was telling this halakha of Rav. So here it's Rav Nachman gets questioned about it after he quotes it by Rav Acha bar Menyum. He says, the Mishnah daf kufchet that we'll see very shortly, Hechan pikdoni amar le'avad. I go to Ruth, I say, where's my pikadon I gave you? Where's the item I gave you to watch? And she says, it got lost. Must be a chani. I say, I'm going to make you take an oath about this. V'amar amen. And she said, okay, which really means, amen, I just took an oath. So she takes an oath. And then witnesses come and say, oh, it was my animal. Ruth ate it, actually. We saw her eat the animal. She has to pay the principal. If she admits it herself, because this isn't ganav. Ganav is kefel. If she claims it was lost, she only pays one. So what do you see here? She does have to pay when the witnesses come, right? Rav said, you don't have to pay. This is the exact case, and yet she doesn't have to pay. So Rav Nachman's going to now give an answer. There's a difference between a shvua in a court and a shvua outside a court. Okay, usually shvua inside the court is done with the Sefer Torah, with God's name. It could be the shvua outside the court wasn't with God's name, or at least wasn't with the Sefer Torah. It's a less severe one, which means if Rav's whole thing is, I got something, I got a shvua, well, it's only if it should shvua in the name of God and in a court, not if it was a shvua that wasn't in a court. So if it was a shvua not in the court, then Ruth's going to have to pay if the witnesses come later. But if it was a shvua in the court, she won't have to pay anything. So but that doesn't work with the rest of the Mishnah, because what does the Mishnah say after that? Which you're not going to be able to say this happened outside of court. I go to Ruth, where's my pikadon? Amar lo nignav. She says it was stolen. Must be a chani. I say, well, you swear that it was stolen? V'amar amen. And she says, yes. If witnesses then come and say she stole it, she pays the double payment. But if she admits it herself, now, you can't say this happened outside of the Beit Din. Why? By the way, the study guide today starts with this whole statement of Rav and all the sections about it, just so you know. If it happened outside the court, there wouldn't be kefel payment. Kefel payment is only when there's an oath in court. You don't pay kefel. Kefel is a court-imposed punishment. It wouldn't happen if the oath happened out of court. So if the oath happened out of court in the second part of the Mishnah, obviously the oath happened outside in the court in the first part of the Mishnah, which then leads us back to the question of Rav. You can't say, oh, one was in the court, one was, if it happens out of the court, that this was out of the court. Can't be. Well, Amrle, Rav Nachman says, I could have tried to tell you and tried to convince you that the first part of the Mishnah is outside the court. That was where we asked our question from. The second part of the Mishnah was inside the court, and then that's fine. Now, I don't want to go into this because we just don't have time, but and it'll take a while to understand this. And if you don't, it's okay, you can ignore me. But I will tell you, the second part of this Mishnah also raises a question against Rav. Okay, they're addressing it as if only the first part is asking a question. Now, that's going to be because, again, this is a little tricky to understand now. In the conclusion, they're going to narrow down Rav and say he wasn't talking about a case of when Ruth claims it was stolen. It's only a case where Ruth claims it was lost. And that's why only the first part is a question against Rav. Because Rav would agree in the second case that actually Ruth would have to pay the kefil when the witnesses come. So that's an aside because we haven't gotten there yet. It's like as if the Gemara thought that you already got to the end and knew that at this point. So if you think, what about the second part? It also contradicts, just ignore your thoughts because we'll resolve that later. But basically what he's saying is, I could have given you an answer. Like the second part is in the court, and the first part, which was the problematic part of this Mishnah, is outside the court. But I don't like to give you weak answers. That's a weak answer. Because why would the Mishnah talk about one in the court, one out of the court? But I'll give you an answer that also might raise some questions, but at least it's less. Both are in court, but now we're going to distinguish between in-court oaths. Even within them, there's type 1, type 2. There's a stronger one and a weaker one. And again, the stronger the oath, the more likely Ruth won't have to pay anything later. Because if she gives me such a strong oath, that should be enough for me, even if she really lied. There's a case where Ruth will just decide that we're judging in the court, and Ruth says, oh, you don't think I'm telling the truth? I'll take an oath. That's a weaker oath. If the court imposed the oath, then the witnesses, then that'll be sufficient for me. If she does it on her own, that's a weaker oath, even if it's in the court. And then that's the case where we're going to say, in other words, if she was kafatz, that's when, if she does it on her own, then even if witnesses come later, she'll still have to pay me because that wasn't a strong enough oath. If it was a very strong oath, the second part of the Mishnah would be a very strong oath, then that Rav wasn't talking about. And that's what we'll say the second part of the oath is. Right? I'm sorry, B'shalo kafatz, that's what Rav was talking about. So basically what we do is we say the first part of the Mishnah, which didn't agree with Rav, is talking about a different case. Rav was talking about when the court imposed it, and this one was talking about when she jumped up ahead and did it on her own. And the second part of the Mishnah, which didn't contradict Rav, you would say would be B'shet, when just like Rav was talking about, right, the serious type oath where the court imposed it. And that's how you would distinguish. Okay, now, Amar Rami bar Chama, the Rav Nachman. Okay, so that was the first question against Rav, we answered. But now, if you remember, the question was asked to Rav Nachman. So Rami bar Chama says to Rav Nachman, this is a total aside. I know you don't hold by Rav in this issue. Okay, so by the way, if you thought Rav was a crazy opinion, you see Rav Nachman didn't hold by him, right? It was a bit of an issue. So why are you trying so hard to explain this Mishnah according to Rav? You don't even hold by him. I wanted to just understand how Rav read this Mishnah. So even though I don't hold by him, I was still explaining it. Okay, now we're going to say, well, why didn't you hold like Rav? Rav Kraka Amar. He had this pasuk. That's a pretty good proof. That what did the Baalim get if not an oath? And now they don't ever have to pay. So how can you go against Rav? Amre, I understand the pasuk in a totally different way. And this goes back to something we learned at the beginning of the daf. What does it mean? It means who takes the oath? The one who's not supposed to pay. Remember we said, Nishba ve'eno meshalem. Kra, Amar Kra, lechol hanishba'in shebetorah nishba'in v'lo mishalmim hu da'ata, v'lakach ba'alav v'lo yishalem. What does that mean? Misha alav l'shalem hu nishba. The one who's supposed to pay, they're the one who takes the oath. And this teaches you about oaths in general, about how oaths work. They're always placed on when there is an obligation to take an oath. It's always the one who's not supposed to pay, right? Except for the few exceptions that we'll see as we learn more of Masechet Nezikin and Shvuot. Okay, now, Mativ Rav Hamnuna, second question. Hishbiya alav hamisha pa'amim. This is the one that's going to be a little bit more confusing, and we're going to have two interpretations of it later. We're going to come back to this and explain it a little bit differently. Okay, this is a weird case. They made him take an oath 5 times. Bein b'fnei beit. So we made Ruth take an oath about the same thing 5 times. Bein b'fnei beitin, bein shelo b'fnei beitin, v'kafar alav. Okay, she took an oath 5 times. Some people say that what happened was I brought her to court, and then she took an oath, and we were done. Then I decided to bring her to a different court who didn't even know that she had taken an oath in the first court, and they made her take a shvuah, and they made her take a shvuah, they made her take a shvuah, and then Ruth feels bad that she took all these oaths, and she comes and admits, well, chayava kol echad ve'echad. She has to, even though she did one admission at the end, she made 5 oaths. She has to bring a korban asham, let's say, and maybe the chomesh also, on all 5. Rabbi Chiya, matam, what's the reason? Because each one she could have potentially admitted in between, so that makes each one a separate claim. Now, what's the problem? Okay, the connection to Rav is a little bit not as clear. Now, according to Rav, what happened? As soon as you take an oath, Ruth's oath basically turns this item into her own, basically. She's done. She's done with me forever. If she's done with me forever, then the next oath should have been an irrelevant oath. She certainly shouldn't need to bring a korban on it because it was an irrelevant oath. She didn't owe me anything anymore. We had no relationship anymore. She was done. So it doesn't really make any sense. And if you want to answer like the previous, that maybe this wasn't an oath in the court, and maybe she, even if it was in the court, she jumped up and took the oath. You couldn't say kafatz because hishbiya alav katani. It says in the source, hishbiya alav hamisha pamim. They insisted she take an oath. That means the court. Chutz lebeitin lo matzid amar. You can't say it was outside the court because it said bifnei beitin katani. It said explicitly, whether it's in the court, whether it's outside of the court, it doesn't matter. So how does that work? He brought the question. He answers it. Litzdadin katani. You can split this into 2, meaning the 2 words hishbiya alav and chutz lebeitin. We thought that was one thing. The court right? They made you take an oath, whether it was in the court, whether it wasn't in the court. Now they're going to say those are 2 different things, and we're going to answer it exactly as we answered the previous. Hishbiya alav means chutz lebeitin. They said, Ruth, you should take an oath, but it was outside the court, meaning it wasn't the same kind of oath. And therefore, again, it didn't exempt Ruth forever. And if it was bebeitin, it would be a case of kafatz, where Ruth initiated taking the oath in the court, not that the court imposed it. And that's how we resolve it. A bit of a weak resolving, but it's a resolution. Third question and final one, and this one we don't have an answer to. Amar mativ Rava, and then because of this, we're going to have to reinterpret what Rav really said. And this time, Rava is really going to narrow down what Rav's case was. Now, this is something we know. We've learned this, and it's very obvious, and that's why Rav didn't make any sense to it. So I claim, right? Ruth, she claims, you gave me an item to watch. I don't know what you're trying, right? It was stolen from me. I don't have it anymore. Vinishban, she takes an oath on that. Vihoda, and she then admits. Ubao edim, and then witnesses come, right? So now, in this case, both happened. Both she admitted and the witnesses came. The question is just what order. Im ad shelo bao edim hoda. If first she admitted, confessed, then the witnesses came, she would have to pay keren b'chomesh v'asham. She doesn't pay keren, chomesh, asham, and kefel. In other words, there's either kefel or there's the principal, right? There's either the principal times 2. That's if there's witnesses. If it was a confession, then there's keren, chomesh, and asham, the principal, the extra 5th payment, and the korban asham. If it's both, so we don't do both. So what do we do? Well, she would only pay the keren, chomesh, v'asham if the confession came first. The imishabau edim hoda. If only once the edim came, then the confession came, she pays tashlumei kefel and the asham. The asham comes, but she doesn't pay chomesh and kefel. You don't do both of those. Now, here, chutz lebeitin and kafatz lo matzit amart. Why? It can't possibly be it wasn't in the court or kafatz, because it says kefel katani. Kefel is only going to be instituted when Ruth gives a shvua in the court that the court imposed, and she lied, then she'd have to pay the kefil. So now we're stuck. To which Rava says the following. And now he's going to first say all the cases Rav did not say his case about. And basically, because this says it explicitly in the Torah that this is what you do, and therefore he's going to narrow Rav to one unique case. And that's going to be, when I mentioned this before, now you can go back and learn the sugya earlier and you'll understand what I said. El Amarav, Kol Hoda, if Ruth admits it, doesn't matter. Lo shnato ein tanarava, lo shnato ein tanakana. We're going to talk about two cases. One is Ruth claims the item I gave to her. She either says it was lost from her house or it was stolen from her house. Now, if she says lost or stolen and then admits that she lied under oath, it doesn't make a difference. Either which way, lo amar Rav. Rav wasn't talking about that case. Dehaktiv, because it says vihit vada. Once she admits, debai shilum keren b'chomesh. You definitely have to pay the keren chomesh and obviously also the korban asham. Once she admits she wants to do tshuva, she's obviously going to have to do that because the only way to get repentance is to do that. Okay, but to'en tanak ganav, we're now going to have a split. Okay, if she claims it was stolen, it's going to depend whether witnesses came or whether she admits. If ba'u edim nami lo amarav. If she claims tanak ganav and then witnesses came, Rav also didn't say it there. Tehaktiv tashlume. I'm sorry, to'en tanak ganav. I just said it wrong. We're going to split between to'en tanak ganav and to'en tanaravad. Okay, if Ruth admits, it doesn't make a difference. There's no distinction between the two cases. But if witnesses come, it depends. If it was gneva, well then, she claims it was stolen. Then witnesses come. He also didn't say there because the Torah explicitly says you have to pay kefil there. We spent a long time on this a while back. Da'aktiv tashlume kefil. It says in the Torah, if you take an oath and then, right, you claim it was stolen and it wasn't, if you remember, then they go, they take an oath, or nikra balabayit el Elohim. Right, that's what the quote in the dedication today. They go to the court, and then if it turns out she lied, she has to pay kefil. So obviously, what does it mean? It turns out she lied, she pays kefil. Obviously, if witnesses came, the Torah says that. So Rav obviously didn't mean that case. But ki kamar, when did Rav say it then? Kigon shetoen tana avad v'nishba v'lohoda uba'ed. It would have to be, we're narrowing. Ruth claimed it was lost. Then what happened? Then she didn't admit that she lied, okay, but witnesses came. In that case, I don't get it back, okay? I don't get my money ever. That's what Rav was talking about. And now we're going to say, okay, so that's basically, we could have ended the sugi here, but we have a bit of a problem because so now you can see how everyone was grappling with this because they really had trouble understanding it. Rav Gamda goes to Rav Ashi and says, this is generations later, now, I know Rav Hamnuna was the student of Rav. How could Rava have said that Rav wasn't talking about a case of admission when Rav Hamnuna's question was all about admitting? Because what was Rav Hamnuna's question? Rav Hamnuna said, if they made Ruth take an oath 5 times, right? She went and took an oath 5 times in the court, whether it was in the court, whether it was out of the court, and then she denies it. She has to bring korban asham on each one. Why? Rabbi Shimon says, what's the reason? Because she could have admitted within each one. Because they're talking about admitting there, the assumption is it's talking about even if she admits. So he brought up a question against Rav relating to admitting and resolved it relating to admitting, which means that Rav Hamnuna must have thought that Rav said is even in a case where Ruth admits, she still doesn't have to pay. So how did Rava, who wasn't a student of Rav, think that he knew Rav better than Rav Hamnuna did, and think that Rav wasn't talking about a case of Hoda. So now we're going to have to reinterpret Rav Hamnuna to say it wasn't the focus on the Hoda'ah, okay? Let's reinterpret it and show that really Rav Hamnuna also thought that Rav only held it about witnesses. When witnesses come, and here we're going to explain it. So Amalei Rav Acha Saba le Rav Ashi. It's interesting because he questioned someone, but then he asked Rav Ashi, someone else brought the answer. Rav Ashi didn't know the answer. Right, it was Rav Gamda said before Rav Ashi. No, Rav Ashi questioned Rav Gamda. Rav Gamda didn't have the answer, but someone else brought the answer. Rav Hamnuna hachi kakashele. This was really Rav Hamnuna's question. From here we get to Amud Ben. Iyamar bishlaman nishba. Okay, now we're basically going to say, and the first part's not so clear how it works until we get to the second part, which it's going to be a process of elimination. Since the second way of reading it doesn't work, we're going to go with the first. So it's going to go like this. Rav Hamnuna brought his source and said, my source only makes sense if you don't agree with Rav. And it doesn't make sense if you go with Rav. So again, the first part of what does make sense is not going to be as clear until we see why it doesn't make sense. So my source that I brought, Rav Hamnuna is saying, again, this is all just explaining Rav Hamnuna's question. We're not going to go back to his answer. His answer is his answer, and it stands. We're just reinterpreting his question. His question didn't presume that Rav meant in a case where the person admits they're going to be exempt. That definitely isn't the case, which also makes sense. Because if you admit, the whole idea is you want to get atonement, and you need to get atonement by paying something. Not that Rav makes sense in the other cases either, but at least we can have some logic. If you're going to say mishbak yatu edim chayev, if you're going to say against Rav, that if witnesses came after you took an oath, you're going to be liable. Excuse me 1 second. Remember, it was the case where Ruth took 5 oaths. She takes 5 oaths. If the witnesses were to come after each one, after each time and say, each one independently, it doesn't matter. But if witnesses were to come, Ruth would be liable. Then I understand why she'll have to take a korban shvu on each one, because each one she's liable for. Ho'il v'yachol lachzor lahodot. Now here comes in the hodah. Because Ruth could have theoretically admitted after each one, that means that Ruth isn't finished with this at this point. It's not end game once she takes an oath. Each time she can take an admission, which means that each time, if witnesses were to come, they could actually make her liable. That would make sense. But, which basically means she still owes the money, in theory, right? The fact that she could admit means that there's still an obligation here. And that fits well if you say, Kiatu Edim Chayim. But, and like I said, it'll be more clear when we reject the next understanding, which is Rav. But if you're going to say that if witnesses are to come, once Ruth takes one oath, the first oath, she no longer has any obligation to me because she's done with me if witnesses were to come. You're going to say, you're going to say that if witnesses were to come, she'd be exempt. And now we're going to make her chayav on 5 shvuot. After she took the first shvuah, she's already done with me. And you're going to say, what did Rabbi Shimon say? It's because theoretically, potentially, she could have admitted. Now, the facts on the ground are, if witnesses, which are the strongest type of thing, would come, Ruth doesn't have to pay. Now we're going to say, because of the potential that she could have theoretically admitted, even though she didn't admit, that's going to make her chayav a korban on each one. That doesn't make any sense. If you hold that she's exempt after the first shvuah, then the rest of the shvuot should be irrelevant shvuot because she doesn't owe me money anymore. We're finished. So if she takes another oath, I understand on that first oath, so if she admits, she'll have to pay me, but to get atonement. But all the successive oaths weren't really anything because if witnesses came, right, she'd be exempt. So she shouldn't have to pay a shvuah on all that. So that doesn't fit with Rav because Rav says you have to get, the source said, you have to take a shvuah on every single one. It makes no sense that the second shvuah should have any relevance whatsoever because she's already finished, okay, according to Rav. So basically, that was his question. It's not because he's saying Rav thinks his case is even in the case where Hodah. Rav Hamnuna didn't think that either. So in the end, we modified Rav. We narrowed it down into saying it's only To'en Tanat Avad. She claims it was lost because To'en Tanat Avad says explicitly in the Torah you're going to have to pay kefel. And it's only if witnesses come, then Ruth will be exempt, actually. But if she admits, she'll obviously have to pay to get atonement. And if it was To'en Tanat Avad, she's going to have to pay the kefil because the Torah says. Okay, now moving on. That was the complicated part of today's daf. So now we're going to move on to 3 statements. We're only going to see 2 of them today. The third one we'll leave for tomorrow. Tomorrow's daf is much shorter. Amar Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to have 3 statements. Rabbi Chiya bar Abba says the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Like I said, we'll see 2 right now. Hato'en Tanat Ganav b'pikadon mishalem tashlumei kefel. Tavach u'machal mishalem tashlumei 4 ו-5. You claim, Ruth says, it was stolen. I don't have it anymore. And, okay, so number 1, if witnesses come, she has to pay double. And if witnesses come and say she slaughtered or sold it, she has to pay the 4 or 5. Now we go back to chapter 7. Why? Well, it's very simple. We're going to make what we call a binyan av. We're going to learn from the paradigm of Geneva. Just like in a theft case, so we're going to compare a ganav a real thief who comes into my house and steals an item, to Ruth type of thief in this case, where I gave her something to watch and she claims it as her own. Same thing, really. Okay, maybe yes, maybe no. Right now we're going to say same thing. So just like a ganav, ma ganav shu mishalem kefel, and if tabachu machar mishalem tashlomei arba b'chamisha, if he slaughtered or sold it, he'll have to pay 4 or 5 times the payment. So the same is going to apply for them. And this is basically because the Torah said to kefel, it didn't say arba b'chamisha, but we assume the same would be true. But now they say if it's a binyanav, we can knock this down. Because a thief doesn't ever take a false oath. A thief just steals and is already liable for the 4 and 5 if he sells what he stole or she sells. But if Ruth steals it, she's only going to have to pay the kefel if she took an oath under, right? I took an oath. So that means it's a more lenient because she's not going to have to pay if she didn't take an oath. So that she won't have to pay the kefel. So you can't necessarily build a paradigm because that halakha of ganav is more strict. Maybe that's why our Rabbi Chamisha applies there. Maybe it wouldn't apply here. Question on Rabbi Yochanan. Amrei hakeshahu ve'em shivin al hakesha. It's not learned out from a paradigm of binyan av. It's learned out from a hakesh. They're juxtaposed in the pasuk. Well, this is going to depend on how you read the pasukim. This is going to remind us of a sugya. I don't have enough time to review the entire thing, but if you remember in Shemot chapter 22, verses 6 through 8, okay, if you give someone kesef or kelim to watch and they're stolen, if you find the ganav, you pay double. We said that's a ganav. And then im lo yimatzeh ganav, if you don't find the ganav, and then they go likrav balabayat Elohim, they go to the judge. Im lo shalach yado melech re'eu, and then he says, right, if he didn't use the item, well, that's all later. Anyway, I'll call it our pesha and that. I'll show you mark yuzeh. And then we say that's to'en tanak ganav. So the first pasuk was ganav, then it went to to'en tanak ganav. Then we say juxtaposition, hakesha. Then you don't have these questions of, oh, one is more severe than the other. They're juxtaposed to learn from one to the other. But that's only hanicha laman damar chab ganav achad b'toin tanak ganav shapir. You remember, we read those pasukim in 2 different ways. One said that first pasuk vav 6 is about a ganav. 7 and 8 is about a toin tanak ganav. Okay, they're 2 different cases. But laman damar hay im yimatzeh ganav im lo yimatzeh travayu b'toin tanak ganav. But the one who says that those 3 pasukim are all talking about a pikadon case where you got it and then you claimed it was yours, and it's not talking about a ganav at all, and the ganav is in a different pasuk. Ma'i kalamemer. How are you going to explain this? So they say Amri ganav haganav because it says haganav. We're going to learn from there. There's 2 ganavim that we're talking about. We can compare the 2. Okay, so that's Rabbi Yochanan. But now, so we kind of asked one question on him. How do you, from your learning, we could kind of question it, but we resolved it. Now we're going to have a different question. Rabbi Chiya bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan. Here's another source that contradicts. Hechan sholi. I go to Ruth. Where's my ox? Nignav. She says it was stolen. Must be a chani. I said I'll make you take an oath. Ba'amar amen. And she says okay. So she takes an oath. Va'edim yidimoto shachalo. And then Edim come and said she ate the animal. Mishalem tashlum kefel. Now, let's just think about it. How'd she eat the animal? Well, she might be a thief, but we assume she shechted the animal. Well, then ganav v'tavach. This should be arba b'chamisha. It only says kefel. It doesn't say arba b'chamisha. So if you're right, Rabbi Yochanan, since you can't eat meat without slaughtering it, from there it seems like you only pay double payment, not 4 or 5. Lo, you don't pay the 4 or 5. So we're going to have an answer here. Okay, she's a thief. Maybe she also eats nevela. She didn't care. She just stabbed the animal and ate it. Okay. So now they're going to just suggest, why don't you say some other possibilities? Better than eating a nevela, let's just say maybe she slaughtered it, but it became a treifa, and she wouldn't be chayiv on tvicha mechira, because if you remember, we learned slaughtering that's not a good slaughtering isn't called shchita. So that would be a case where it's not tabachu machal, or it was a treifa. The animal was already sick before. So Rabbi Meir Damar shchita she'ena ruyah shma shchita. If you remember, that was a machloket. We could say that this source didn't say that. We didn't answer this for the source because maybe this source holds that even a treifa shchita, because they actually did the act of slaughtering, it's still called shchita and you'd be liable to 4 or 5. That's why they didn't answer that. But the shani nami beben pekua. Case of a ben pekua, this is a fetus. It's in the fetus of an animal that was slaughtered is able to be eaten without slaughtering it. So there you could have a case where she ate the animal that was inside an animal that was actually slaughtered. It's not called, she didn't tabachu machar that animal, and that's the one she stole. So again, they say, no, you could say they didn't answer that because Rabbi Meir damar ben pkua ta'un shchita. Rabbi Meir has a unique shita that ben pkua needs shchita, and that's why they didn't bring this, because if it was ben pkua, she would have had to have slaughtered it, and then she would be liable to 4 or 5. Now they're going to have 2 answers, actually could be. What if she was already convicted as a thief? At that point, and they ruled sentencing, you have to give the animal back, and then she slaughtered it, because that would be a good answer. If after they rule that, you'd be exempt. Why? Well, remember, tabachu machar is only if you're a ganav. At that point, when the court tells you have to return it, you turn into a gazlan, okay? Because it's already out in the open. It's more like you have someone's item in your possession that you're not giving back. That's a gazlan. And then you wouldn't be chayav yarbah chamisha. Only if it's chayav atalitain, though, if the court says you really should give it back, but they didn't rule clearly, then tabachu machar you'd be chayav. So why don't we just say it was after the court ruled clearly, and that's why there's no arbah chamisha. My time up. What's the reason, by the way, for this distinction? Okay, if they're not clear cut about it, you're still a ganav. But once they rule definitively, you're a gazlan. And then there'd be no 4 or 5, to which they say, Amre, if you want to suggest that one, we could actually suggest another one. Let's say you stole the animal with someone and then you slaughtered it without checking with your partner. In that case, we already learned you're not chayav 4 or 5. Maybe that's what it's talking about. They just gave 1 out of 3 potentials. In other words, the fact that they said it was an avela, there was no shchita, and that's why, 4 or 5, they could have brought these other 2 answers as well. Okay, last part for today. Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, Rabbi Yochanan. So I know it's a very long daf, at least the one for Shabbat is shorter. Now we're not talking about, before we talked about, don't confuse these, to'en tanat avad. That's when Ruth claims after I gave it to her, it was lost. This is, Ruth found my lost item on the street, picked it up, not that I gave her as a pikadon. She found a lost item on the street, picked it up, knew she had to return it, but didn't, and decided to just keep it for herself. And then when I come and say, hey, that's mine, she says, I don't have it anymore. So, it was stolen from me. So Rabbi Chiya bar Abba says in there, Rabbi Yochanan, if you claim in a lost item that it was stolen, you also have to pay kefil. It's not just in a pikadon, it's also if you found a lost item. My time, because the pasuk where it talks about it says, and on, right, I'll call bar pesha, I'll call aveda, even lost items. They come and ask a question now. Wait a minute. It's a bit of a cupcake question. Ki tain ish. Now, the whole section started, if you give a man. From there, we learn, ein tinat katan klum. If you want to learn more about katan, in Dini Daf this week, it was all about the katan. Right, we're doing Alana Steinhain did a series on Chereshote and Katan. So now we're up to the Katan. It also comes up in today's daf. Ein tinat katan klum. If I was a minor when I gave Ruth the item to watch, I don't have any claim. Okay, all these laws don't apply. Okay, does this mean if I gave it when I was a minor and the whole claim happened when I was a minor? What about nitanok shu katan? What if I gave it to her when I was a minor? Utvaok shu gadol minayim. But I claimed the claim, right? When I claimed, wait, you stole this from me, was when I was already older. Talmud lomar ad Elohim yavo dvar shnehem. Ad Elohim is the when I claim in court. Yavo dvar shnehem is our history. What happened? The story. So both have to happen when I'm a gadol. If I'm not a gadol, then I have no claim against Ruth. Agitate, in other words, again, this whole thing, if Ruth takes an oath, has to pay kefil, all that is not applicable because I wasn't a gadol at the time, because it starts with ki yitain ish. You need both things. It sounds like Shabbat. You need the akira and the halakha, right? The uprooting and the putting it down. You need the giving and the claim. All have to be when I'm older. Vim ita to having namika aveda, but why should it be any different than aveda? Aveda, there's no nitina. You picked it up. It doesn't matter my age at the time, right? That's an irrelevant factor because I wasn't even in the picture at the time. You just picked up a lost item on the street. So if aveda is the same halakha, then you shouldn't need nitina. So we're going to have 2 directions here. So amarle hachba ma'askina kagon she'achlok shu katan. So now he says, what's the case? The case is it's not the netina that's important, it's the eating of it. When did you destroy the item? When did you take the animal, slaughter it, and eat it, let's say? If that has to happen, if it happens when I'm still a minor, like the act of sinning is really when you eat it, consume it. But kishu gadol mai hachinami demishalem, wait. So if that's the case, you're going to say, if I was a gadol at the time you ate it, you would have to pay. Well, then that doesn't fit with the wording. It should have said, not the nitina and the tviya, it should have said, so that answer doesn't really work. To which the answer, they say just change the wording. What it really meant is the consumption of it and the claim all had to be when I'm older. And then it would be, then it would have its perfect parallel in the Aveda case. You've picked up my lost item, you ate it, consumed it, right? And then that has to happen when I'm older, and the other one has to happen when I'm older. But Rav Ashi gives a different answer, and with this we'll finish for today. Lo dami. There are two different things. Aveda ka'ate mikoch ben dat. Vaha lo ate mikoch ben dat. Okay, there's different ways to read this line. I'm going to do it the way that made more sense to me. In Aveda, got to you when you, by means of a ben dat. What does that mean? Well, I wasn't a party there. So the fact that I was a minor is irrelevant because you were a ben dad and you picked it up. So that happened with dad, with consent. When I give you an item to watch, that didn't happen with a ben dad because I was a minor. That's why netina is important in this case and it's not important in a Veda case. And that's why the comparison was just wrong from the start. Okay, long daf, quick review. I know it's very late, but let's just try to get through a quick review. We started with the statement of Rav Sheshet, this halakha that just by denying a claim, you already become a thief. We had some questions on it. We resolved them right after rejecting yesterday the proof for him. We then went to this statement because on a tangent, we got into this as an answer to one of the questions. We got into the statement of Rav that basically if you're nishba and then witnesses come, you don't have to pay anymore. After having three questions, two of them we answered, the third we didn't. We then narrowed it down to a very unique case. Then we get to two statements of Rabbi Chiya, Abba, and then Rabbi Yochanan. One about to entanak and Abba pikadon. There's also Abba chamisha if you slaughter it. And then we had some questions on that. And then we had to entanak and Abba aveda. You also have to be, and that we asked a question and resolved it. Very long daf. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom and Bisarot Tovot.